On April 16, 1746, the wind-swept moors of Culloden became the site of one of the most decisive and brutal battles in British history. Here, the Jacobite forces, led by Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, clashed with the Duke of Cumberland's government army. The battle lasted less than an hour, but in that brief time, the Jacobite dream of restoring the Stuart monarchy to the British throne was crushed. With thousands of Jacobites killed or wounded, Culloden marked the end of the 1745 rebellion and changed Scotland forever. The Jacobite movement aimed to restore the Stuart dynasty to the British throne, challenging the legitimacy of the Hanoverian monarchy. Many Scots, particularly Highland clans, remained loyal to James Francis Edward Stuart, the son of the deposed King James II. They believed that the Stuarts were the rightful rulers of Britain, rather than the German-born King George II. France, eager to destabilize Britain, offered limited support to the Jacobites, encouraging Prince Charles Edward Stuart, later known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, to lead an uprising. Determined to reclaim his family's throne, Charles landed in Scotland in July 1745, rallying Highland clans to his cause. Bonnie Prince Charlie's campaign began with remarkable success. With a force of determined Highlanders, he quickly marched south and captured Edinburgh without resistance. His army met government troops at the Battle of Prestonpans in September 1745. Using the Highland Charge, a ferocious attack with broadswords and muskets, the Jacobites overwhelmed the British army in less than 15 minutes. This stunning victory electrified supporters and convinced Charles that reclaiming the throne was within reach. With momentum on his side, he turned his attention south, hoping to gather more support in England. In November 1745, the Jacobite army crossed into England and advanced as far as Derby, just 130 miles from London. However, the army faced growing resistance instead of finding English and Welsh allies. The expected uprising among English Jacobites never materialized, and promised French reinforcements failed to arrive. Meanwhile, the British army regrouped, and King George II's forces prepared to counterattack. With supply lines stretched thin and facing the risk of being cut off, Jacobite commanders urged Charles to retreat. Against his wishes, they abandoned the advance on London and returned to Scotland. The retreat marked a turning point in the rebellion. While the Jacobites won another victory at the Battle of Falkirk in January 1746, they struggled to maintain supplies and discipline. British forces, now under the command of the Duke of Cumberland, launched a relentless pursuit, giving the Jacobites little time to regroup. Divisions grew within Charles's ranks as many Highlanders, exhausted from months of marching and fighting, deserted. Cumberland's forces continued pressing forward, forcing Charles to make a desperate last stand at Culloden Moor in April 1746. The final battle would bring the rebellion to a violent and tragic end. The Battle of Culloden was the final and most decisive confrontation of the Jacobite Rising of 1745. On one side stood the Jacobite army, approximately 5,500 strong and composed mainly of Highland clans, and led by Prince Charles Edward Stuart, cornered and facing the British forces. Opposing them was the British army, led by Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, the son of King George II. With nearly 7,000 to 9,000 well-trained soldiers, Cumberland's forces were better equipped and disciplined, giving them a crucial advantage over the outnumbered and fatigued Jacobites. Despite their fierce determination, the Highlanders faced insurmountable odds on that fateful morning. Culloden Moor, chosen as the battlefield, proved disastrous for the Jacobites. The open marshy terrain neutralized the agility and speed of the Highland charge, which had been key to their previous victories. The uneven ground, softened by heavy rain, slowed their movements and made coordinated attacks difficult. Unlike previous battlefields that allowed Highland warriors to engage in close combat, the Battle of Culloden exposed them to devastating long-range attacks. As the battle began, the Jacobites struggled to maintain formation while the British artillery unleashed relentless fire upon them. The Jacobites' most feared tactic, the Highland charge, was their only hope for victory. However, Cumberland's forces were prepared. As the Highlanders surged forward, they were met with continuous volleys of musket fire, which cut down their ranks before they could reach British lines. The disciplined government troops, arranged in tight formations, exploited the gaps in the Jacobite ranks. Historian John Preble described the scene. They fell in clumps, blown apart by cannon fire, slashed down by sabres before they could raise their broadswords. The charge, which had carried them to victory at Prestonpans and Falkirk, failed utterly at Culloden. Cumberland's army deployed superior artillery tactics, using grapeshot to rip through the Jacobite forces. The Highlanders, wearing minimal armor, had no protection against the deadly blasts. The British soldiers, trained to reload and fire rapidly, maintained an unrelenting assault. When the shattered Jacobite charge finally reached British lines, they found themselves met with bayonets rather than swords. British infantry had been trained to thrust rather than slash, ensuring maximum lethality in close combat. The Highlanders, exhausted and disoriented, were unable to break through. The battle was over in less than an hour. By the time the fighting ceased, more than 1,500 Jacobites lay dead, with hundreds more wounded. In contrast, the British army suffered fewer than 300 casualties. The Jacobites who attempted to flee were cut down as Cumberland's forces pursued them across the Moor. British cavalry hunted down the retreating Highlanders, slaughtering many in the aftermath. Survivors who were captured faced an even grimmer fate. Many were executed, imprisoned, or transported to the colonies as forced labourers. Culloden was not just a military defeat, it marked the collapse of the Jacobite cause. Bonnie Prince Charlie, who had once inspired thousands to rise against the British crown, barely escaped the battlefield. He fled into the Highlands and later to France, spending the rest of his life in exile. His dream of restoring the Stuart monarchy ended in ruin. Meanwhile, the British government sought to ensure that another uprising would never occur. Cumberland's troops, earning him the infamous nickname Butcher Cumberland, ruthlessly pursued and executed fleeing Jacobites. Although the Jacobites suffered a devastating defeat at Culloden, their cause was not immediately extinguished. Though humiliated and on the run, Prince Charles Edward Stuart remained a symbol of defiance. Evading capture for 5 months, he moved between sympathizers in the Highlands, aided by loyal supporters. One such sympathizer, Flora MacDonald, famously helped him escape to the Isle of Skye disguised as a maid. His flight kept the flickering hope of rebellion alive, but the British government was determined to ensure that the Jacobite threat was permanently crushed. In the wake of the battle, the Duke of Cumberland, son of King George II, ordered brutal reprisals against the surviving Jacobites and the Highland communities that had supported them. His men hunted down fleeing rebels across Scotland, executing prisoners and burning homes. Those who had fought for the Jacobites were given no quarter. Many were shot on sight, while others were executed in public as a warning to future rebels. His merciless tactics earned him the infamous title Butcher Cumberland, a name still remembered in Scotland today. For those Jacobites who were captured, the punishment was swift and severe. Hundreds were imprisoned in appalling conditions, while others were sentenced to death. Public executions were held in cities like Edinburgh and London, where high-ranking prisoners were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Many Jacobite soldiers were not executed, but instead transported to British colonies in North America and the Caribbean. There, they were either sold into indentured servitude or forced to serve long sentences, effectively erasing their presence from Scotland. Beyond military retribution, the British government sought to dismantle Highland society itself. The clan system, which had long been the backbone of Jacobite support, was deliberately weakened through the Highland clearances. Land was seized from Jacobite sympathizers, and entire communities were displaced. Over the following decades, landlords evicted tenants in favor of large-scale sheep farming, forcing thousands of Highlanders to migrate to cities or leave Scotland altogether. This marked the beginning of a profound cultural and demographic shift in the Highlands. To further suppress Highland identity, the British government enacted the Act of Proscription in 1746, banning many traditional Scottish customs. Wearing tartan or kilts, carrying weapons, and even playing bagpipes, considered an instrument of war, were outlawed. These measures were designed to break the Highland clan's spirit and prevent any Jacobite support resurgence. The penalties for violating these laws were severe, with harsh imprisonment or deportation being common consequences. The destruction of Highland culture after the Battle of Culloden was one of the most significant consequences of the battle. The erosion of clan leadership and the outlawing of cultural symbols forced many Scots to assimilate into British society or flee abroad. The loss of language, tradition, and land reshaped Scotland forever, leaving a deep wound still felt in Scottish history and identity. Though the Highland way of life never fully recovered, romanticized memories of the Jacobites and their struggle for independence continued to inspire generations. Culloden's aftermath was more than just the end of a rebellion, it was the forced integration of Scotland into a centralized British state. The battle's legacy is still evident today, as many Scots view Culloden as a symbol of lost sovereignty and resistance against oppression. While the Jacobite cause ultimately failed, its impact on Scotland's history and culture remains a powerful reminder of when the Highlands stood in open defiance of British rule.